Well, there's some huge news about Gamemaker, as Yoyogames have just released a blog post about the changes they want to bring to GML in 2019. And these are some real fundamental changes that are going to completely change the way we use Gamemaker. We're looking at functions and method variables, as well as lightweight objects. Now, lightweight objects especially is interesting because that's something we've been asking for as a community for as long as I can remember. I think ever since I've joined the Gamemaker community, maybe 10 years ago, I've seen posts about people asking for these lightweight objects and asking for these method variables as well instead of the user event system that we have at the moment. And so this is really, this is such an important update. So I wanted to start off by talking about what's in this blog post, which, by the way, I really recommend you go read. There'll be a link to it in the description below. But yeah, I want to talk about what did I put here? Yes, the method variables and functions, because these really are the most interesting to me, starting off with the functions, which are kind of going to replace scripts, or more accurately, kind of completely change the way scripts work. So at the moment, we have these big files, or rather really small files actually, where each of them has a different function with a different functionality, and a lot of times it can get a bit annoying because you'll end up with like hundreds of tabs open with each of the different scripts that are like 3 or 4 lines long. So now with this update, with this proposal, I guess that this really is, we'll be able to define multiple functions inside a single source file using the syntax that we have down here. So just function followed by the name of the function we want to have, and then a list of arguments, followed by just the block of code that we want to run when this is called. And this is really cool, first of all, just because we'll be able to define lots of functions together in the same source file, but also because the new syntax allows us to name arguments. And I mean, even though the examples here show just the normal argument variables we're used to, argument 0, argument 1, argument 2, if we go up here, they show that actually this new function syntax can take any argument name, which is really quite cool. So we no longer will have these really weird blocks at the top of our code, which says like var position equals argument 0 and var instance equals argument 1, so on. That won't be a thing anymore. Now the actual signature of a function will have a meaning instead of just being some random number of arguments. Now these functions will be just callable the same way that scripts are right now. So instead of having to do script execute, you'll just be able to have the name of the variable here followed by the argument list in parentheses. You'll be able to assign them to variables and pass them around, which makes them really quite powerful for callback functions. So in a previous video of mine, I talked about dependency injection and how this could be done with the current code, but also how something just like this could actually mean that our callback functions become a lot more ergonomic and easy to use, and also a lot more powerful. So if you haven't seen this, I recommend you do. Just to wrap your head around what this could really mean for people writing libraries, or even just for your own code within your Gamemaker project. Now these functions have another trick up their sleeves, in that if we define them within the scope of an instance, they will bind to that instance, or rather they will bind to that self variable. So within the block, when you call that function, it will apply any change to the instance it was bound to. So there's an example down here. So if we have this with block, we're switching into the scope of the obj enemy, or rather into the scope of every instance of obj enemy, and we're creating a new function named foo. And that way, this function foo will bind to obj enemy instances. So when we call this foo variable, it will change the variables. Any changes to variables, well, instance variables rather, will be applied to obj enemy no matter what scope we are actually calling the function from. So these are essentially methods, and we'll be able to declare them like this, or just simply inside the create event of your object. It would be really cool if they added a new like setup event or something, or like declare event, specifically for these kind of things, where we can define all of the different functions. Perhaps this could even come into play with the object variables that was introduced a few versions back. Now, and yeah, so these methods will allow us to write much more ergonomic code instead of having to write freestanding scripts that then take instances as variables and so on. We'll just be able to define them as methods directly in the objects that they're supposed to manipulate. Or if we want to even just extend an object, we'll be able to use the with block, just like it shows here. Here we're essentially extending obj enemy to have a foo function associated with it, or we could declare the function a bit more similar to this over here in order to make it in order to add a method to enemy objects. Now, the next important update that they're talking about is the lightweight objects. Now, as I mentioned, this is something that people have been craving for a really long time. Previously, it's been emulated using structs. I know that's what I've been doing. However, now they're bringing something much more akin to how JavaScript works, or maybe something similar to a map if you're used to languages like Java or C++ and so on. And here we see the syntax for defining an object in a literal way. So this will be a lightweight object literal. As we can see here, A will be the variable that will hold that lightweight object, and here we have the contents of that lightweight object. Now, it's important to think about these lightweight objects as not having really a type. So our instances at the moment, they have these object indexes, which are essentially their type, even though we can mutate, you can change it. I think I have a video, isn't my latest video about just that, about changing, changing the object of our instances to get them to do different things. But here this will be different. We'll just have a type object, and then different instances of that object, different lightweight objects, will have different variables, not in a tight way, more in a dynamic way. And this actually is quite powerful in some sense, and in some other sense it can be quite difficult to work with in terms of type checking. However, there are some really cool things to do with checking whether a certain object has the capability of doing something. It's kind of a cool dynamic composability thing that we can do with it. I'm really excited to make videos about that because I think I'm gonna enjoy this a lot. So the example we have here is of this object here as giving it kind of in a JSON-like way. We can give it different, assign different expressions to different variables. So here we have the func variable that will get a new function assigned to it. And yeah, well, this is really quite cool. By itself, it will replace the use of just instances, maps, and arrays whenever we need to pass data around. They have an example down here using vectors, which we'll get to because this is also really quite neat. And there's also a couple other tricks we can do with it. I can think one of them I thought of is maybe a useful global var. Now, global var is terrible and you shouldn't use it. However, with these lightweight objects, they could come into play quite nicely, as you could define a lightweight object in the global var scope and then use it as a namespace. So you'll be able to define different, not really global variable, but namespaced variables, or different namespaced functions, or even different namespaced objects that we'll be able to have in there, which will stop things like clashes and will make our code a lot more readable. And again, it will depend on how this is implemented, whether this works, but if it does, I'll definitely be making videos around this concept, and if it doesn't, I'll keep searching. But again, I'm really excited about these updates. Now, these lightweight objects, there's a lot of information about how they might work, how they're, if you assign methods to them, then they're much more similar to classes in languages like C++ or Java. But what's interesting here is the new operator, because the new operator really brings these functions and lightweight objects into something really quite powerful. So here the example they give us is a function vector3, which just sets up some variables here, and then this is actually another variable and just assigns a function to it. And at first it doesn't really look like a class or anything. It just seems to be a function that will change the variables inside an object. And it looks a bit like a constructor, but not really, because it has, it has functions in there, and that's not quite, if you use to object-oriented programming, that's not quite the way we tend to do it. But it all starts to make sense if we look at new. So the way new works would be to create a new empty lightweight object, and then it will call the function you give it with that new within the scope of that new lightweight object. So the example we have here, var vec equals new vector3 10 20 30. New here will create a lightweight object with presumably no default variables assigned to it, and then it will call this vector3 function within the scope of this new object, and then return it into vec. So the new object will then get these variables applied to it, as well as this method variable. So yeah, it's basically objects, and I haven't done much object-oriented JavaScript, but I think it's fairly similar to that. And what's really interesting here is that it may seem like this is a little bit restrictive because we are stuck with like this single constructor here. So if you want to do different things, it might get a little bit tricky. However, what we shouldn't forget is that we should be able to call these functions inside each other. And so we can have a basic like vector3 setup or something like that function, which will create all different methods for it, and have different vector3 constructors which would set up the variables differently. So maybe one of them would set the components individually, and one of them would set them all to the same variable, and so on, and then call the same function, the shared function, in order to set up all the different functions, or I guess they're called methods now, that they would use. So yeah, this is really quite cool and powerful. It's a really smart way to implement this new operator, just calling a function. You could call any function, not just constructors. So yeah, really quite exciting. It also means that we could use these constructors as a way to reinitialize objects, so we get to reuse them, which is actually quite important, because now Gamemaker will come with a much more a much bigger garbage collectors. That's something they talk about near the end. So as we have all these new lightweight objects, we'll need to find a way to delete them. So they already talked about a delete object, which will essentially remove them, a delete function rather, a keyword that will remove them. However, the way that it will work is through the garbage collector. So Gamemaker already has a garbage collector for the arrays. So arrays are, because they're essentially reference counted, and it removes them. But we still have issues with circular dependencies and so on. This sounds like they are putting together a much more robust, much more high performance garbage collector, getting ready for all these lightweight objects so that we're going to have a lot of fun creating. So they're talking about running it once per frame, and this should help with performance because we have much more local code. We don't have to jump around all over the code and so on. So it all sounds really interesting. And that's it for the garbage collector. Not something that we should really have to care about until they add stuff like being able to control the behavior and so on. But they don't really talk about that. So I'm really quite curious to see what they do in terms of letting us control the garbage collector. It'd be cool to be able to turn it off in some sections of our code, or maybe during the game we could turn off the garbage collector, and at the end of a level, if we could call it then, that would be really quite cool, just to avoid any stutter and so on. So we'll have to see what they do with that. Now, there's of course other changes that they talk about. There's the chained accessors. This is really quite straightforward. They'll be able to have these array accesses one after the other, and also being able to do it with different data structures, although they say that this is something they'll be expanding upon, which actually is a clue to me that this might be happening earlier than we think. Since they're talking about expanding upon general accessors, it might mean that they already have the chained accesses working. There's another clue to this if we go down, talking about, I think it was in the garbage collection that they talked about yes, the collector being very fast and having a minimal impact on running game. This also sounds to me like they have something working. Maybe fairly soon we'll be able to see more about that. Hopefully it'll be released as early as possible, so maybe I'll be able to get back into Gamemaker. Now there is another change that I want to talk about, and this one I'm not too excited about, but don't get me wrong, it is very important, and it's exception support. So at the moment, when we have errors, they just appear on the screen, and there's nothing we can do about them. And this is a problem because, generally speaking, we don't want to show errors to our clients, who are actually using our games. But there is really no good alternative at the moment. Now, exception support is going to solve this by introducing the try, catch, and finally block. So if you've used Java, try, catch, finally is quite familiar to you. If you've used C++, then try, catch is the same thing, and the finally block is there to help us clean up some memory. So the way try, catch works really is any code that can produce any exception will go inside the try block. So you're trying to do something, and if an error is thrown, you'll be able to catch it inside the catch block and handle it there. The finally block is there to run any code that has to be run. This means we don't free memory inside the try block, because the try block could end at any point. Instead, we put inside the finally block to make sure that it really does run. Now, the reason that I said I wasn't super excited about it is because I don't feel like try catch is the right way forwards for Gamemaker. I would much have rather have seen multiple return values be used to have like error codes appended to the end of our returns. But whatever, it's still really great to see that we'll finally have a way to deal with errors correctly. It even gives us a way to throw our errors. I think there's already a way to show errors, but now we'll be able to throw them using the throw keyword, which will make people writing libraries also happy, because they'll be able to return errors in a much more sane way. Right now, you would probably want to return different values, maybe return arrays with an error code inside one of the values, or even use global variables or something. It's right now error handling is kind of a mess, so this try catch block is definitely going to help. So yeah, this is basically the changes that they talked about in this blog post. Again, I highly recommend you go read it for yourself. They explained in a lot of detail, really quite interesting stuff. This is going to completely change the way we use GML, so you definitely want to keep an eye out for that. It will actually even break some of the stuff we do. Like, scripts are going to change slightly, but they say they'll be able to automatically convert our projects, so that's nice. However, arrays will change in a significant enough way, especially through 2D arrays, that you might want to check it out, prepare your programs for any future changes that they say to do, because you will want to update once these changes come, because they will truly change everything. So yeah, I am, again, really excited. I can't wait to make a number of videos about all these changes. Whenever they hit, the stable update channel, I'll be, even just the beta update channel, if that's a thing, I can't remember, in order to just dive deep, find out what is possible. Yeah, hope you're excited as I am, and I'll see you guys next time.